Hi, my name's Tashia Dixon and I've come here today from Melbourne Water. I want to thank Adrian. He has just done a great example talking about how Melbourne Water is supporting a lot of local projects, and I'm sure there are many other councils that could do the same. So I'm not going to talk about green infrastructure projects so much. I'm going to talk about some of the authorising environments that we need to start new services that can indeed support some of the things that we're doing, trying to innovate, change and do new things. So Melbourne Water has a new strategic direction which happened in 2012. Now, I'm one of many at Melbourne Water who is part of the business that is really pushing that new direction. And it's really exciting that we're focusing on very different ways of doing things. But of course, there are some significant challenges there. So as an urban designer, I want to move away from looking at just the asset and considering the much broader context that urban designers think about. So the opportunity is to then work with other parts of the business. And what I want to talk about is the challenges that we have, but also the extraordinary opportunities. Melbourne Water owns or manages over 30,000 hectares of land. So we're the second largest land owner and manager in the state. So as an urban designer, you can probably imagine how extraordinary the opportunity is to really influence change. Because it's not just the 33,000 hectares that we can manage or own, it's also the land adjoining our land. So the opportunity is enormous. I wanted to start with this statement because I think it's important to note that, whilst we don't want to always work with an authorising environment where it's all coming from the top down, it is important, I think, for certainly an organisation such as Melbourne Water, that we have this great drive for change and innovation. So we've come from a place where public health is my reward, and I think that was a great way for people to feel very strongly around what they're doing. But the environment we're working in now is extraordinary, enhancing life and livability. So public health is still key, but now we're thinking very much about livability. And that's where myself and others who are working in this climate of great uncertainty are really starting to push the boundaries and take the organisation in a new direction. The second part of that statement, which is focusing very much on the relationships that people have and how we can start to influence those relationships, is so key. I've been at Melbourne Water, as I mentioned, for 2 years, so it's not really a great deal of time in such a complex, large organisation. What I've found is that change, whilst it's great to have that top-down, we really, really need the bottom-up. And the bottom-up needs to have that authorising environment to do that. So there is this constant challenge and balancing act that we need to work with both the management to ensure they can spearhead us in new ideas and new ways of thinking about things, but we really need people who are working at that policy level that have to drive that policy change or have to drive the guideline change. So there really needs to be that ongoing balance. When I look at this list of assets, what I see are many different people, many different faces. Any one of these assets could go through 3, 4, 5 different teams of people at Melbourne Water. So if I'm going to influence urban design and start to think more broadly, moving away from the asset and thinking about the place, then I need to understand what is the culture within each of those teams. We can't make change unless we're really mindful of how these teams are currently working. So we need to start to build really personal relationships. Otherwise, it becomes very challenging. The other aspect of that, which I've found has been quite necessary, is to understand, where do I want people to get to? So what is it that I'm actually selling to people? And the way I see it is that we all have this extraordinary role at Melbourne Water, and I'd say probably most of the people in this audience as well, shaping the city for not just this new generation, but what about 100 years' time? What about 200 years' time? The decisions that we're making, whether we're putting a pipe in the ground or we're putting a pedestrian pathway down, we are shaping the decisions that people make in the future, how they use places, and certainly how that impacts then climate change and those other big issues. So if I was putting a pipe in the ground and I understood that my role was far greater, then that might change the way I think about things. So in terms of embedding urban design or introducing urban design to Melbourne Water, there is only a very small team of us that's doing this work to start with. And there's a good reason why, because we need to understand what the opportunity is. So we're starting with small groups of people or small projects, and we're working very directly with what those impacts are or implications are without having that place-making focus. when we start to build that confidence or build that capacity within those groups, then we're hoping that that will then start to spread out into the organisation further. The idea is normally with a change management process like this, we would start very much with that change management empowerment process. Instead, we've flipped that around and we want to try and build some common language, some just general capacity around what is urban design and how is it important in terms of delivering that resilient city. We've seen that there's been a great response, even I've only been there for a short period of time, where we're hearing the language back to us, where people are starting to think about context and they're starting to think maybe this asset beyond that is really critical in terms of what's happening with that asset and vice versa. So we're thinking more now around the populations that are sitting around these assets and understanding the demographic data around how people use these areas. We're also considering the broader issues, so we're working with other parts of Melbourne Water as well to know climate change issues and those sorts of things. So I want to talk a little bit about some projects that we're working on and how urban design relates to these. And I think that we can influence change on many different levels. But this is a program you may have heard of, Reimagine Your Creeks. And we have $14 million, which we're going to be using to naturalise a number of different creeks across Melbourne. The program is really focusing on naturalising and daylighting and those sorts of things, but where we want to try and broaden the scope is to bring in some more demographic knowledge and understand what the urban design systems and networks are that are informing place. This is really a different way of thinking for Melbourne Water. So in some ways, you may be sitting there going, well, isn't this just a normal kind of standard approach? But really, Melbourne Water has quite often focused on that asset, as I mentioned. So a big part of what we're doing is, of course, building that strong relationship with council, because councils know their areas so well. They have their urban design strategies in place. So this is making sure that we're managing our asset in the best possible way with our partners. So with Arnold's Creek, for example, this site is about 600 metres long. It's, as you can see here on the right-hand side. So this is the branch that we're working on, and there's a second branch here. So it's quite a large area, a grassy floodway. It doesn't have anything around it. So in many ways, it's like a barrier to the community. But you can also see that there's an extraordinary opportunity here, a number of different nodes of activity which may struggle to move around the area based on what's currently happening there. So instead of just looking at the asset, we're also understanding what the cycling and the walking network is, so we can start to bring people to this asset. I think it was mentioned earlier, one of the greatest opportunities that this program has is to introduce people to water in a real way. So trying to connect people back to water and they can spend time with water, touch water and learn about water, which is a really important part of that cultural shift instead of keeping people away from our assets. So I won't go into the detail. This is an initial concept. So this program, we've done some initial concepts on some key programs, or some key sites rather. What we want to do is then take those concepts to council. So it's really important that the community is leading this work, but we want to come up with those grand ideas and try and get the creative juices flowing. But you can see here, I mean, one of the big ones, of course, is urban cooling, is a massive focus of this program because there's great opportunities to do things really, really well here. And again, as I mentioned, the kind of increased pedestrian flow to the area, which is really important because it's wonderful to spend this money, but if people are not aware of it and if people are not going to be connecting to it, of course, we're going to always not reach the target market that we're looking for. And here's just a bit of a computer-generated image. As I mentioned, what's key here is we want to get people down into the water, again, something that we haven't done in the past. We want to get people connected to those spaces. And the other example, which is Sunshine Hospital, and I wanted to bring this one up because it's a really good example of what happens when you collaborate and you work with others. So this site, it's about 800 metres in length. We have a hospital adjoining our site. So, whoops. So this is the hospital just here, and you can see the site. The hospital has got some challenges in terms of access through the ground plane. So when we were looking at this site, we brought together a number of different stakeholders to talk about what some of those issues were. And what was really apparent is that this site really couldn't work as an opportunity unless we were able to really unlock the hospital. So what we did differently is that we decided to get together all of the stakeholders that had a stake in this and talk about how we can't really go forward unless we unlock this site. So we met with the Department of Human Services and we met with Western Health along with some other stakeholders, and we explained to them, look, we want to invest in this site, but we really can't do that unless you do some work beforehand. And so this is just one page of an urban design analysis they did, but now they've gone through and they've identified that they can unlock the site in many ways, so we can start to get all of those benefits for the community. So this is a really great opportunity to see how influence through the work we're doing, and I'd again say probably through a work you're all doing, having those early conversations and talking to sometimes some could be difficult stakeholders who may have a major ownership. If we start looking at those joint benefits, the outcomes can be quite extraordinary and sometimes not what we expect them to be. So I definitely recommend that we have those difficult conversations. So similarly, we want to focus on the urban forest, and again, we'll be taking this design through a process so the community will be able to see what we're doing here and ensuring that we can connect to other open space in the area, which is critically important. And that's how it's going to look sometime in the future. Something like that. That's all. Thank you.